Hi, my name is Carrie Moody. I am a nursing student at Herzing University in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and this is my presentation on Talk About Grief. Grief is always messy. Grief is one of the hardest things that a person has to do. Grief has no time frame. It lasts as long as it lasts, and there are no shortcuts when going through grief. There are ambushes of grief when you don't expect it. Let's talk about what grief is and what it is not, signs and symptoms of grief, myths and facts, ways to take care of yourself, and complicated grief and signs of depression. What grief is. Grief is a personal and individual experience. Experts say that it takes 6 to 9 months for your heart to accept what your head already knows. The person won't be coming back. Grief is a journey that should not be done alone. When in a support group, you see that others feel the things that you do, and that feeling like you're crazy calms down because others feel it too. What grief is, sometimes it's putting your needs first. People are encouraged to enjoy a good day because they are far and few in between those rough days. Grief is taking time, the time that you need to remember your loved one. When people face their grief and work through it, they find that grief and joy can coexist. And grief is very personal. No one has the right to tell you how or what you should do. It's not their journey. Grief is not a linear set of stages to go through. Grief is not moving on and having to forget about your loved one. Grief is not just getting over your feelings. Staying busy and being strong doesn't work. Grief is not something that just ends. People turn the corner on their grief when they start to focus on what they had more than what they've lost. Grief is not struggling to have to keep everything the way it was. You never get over it, you only get through it. Your entire life gets turned upside down, and you have to find a new normal. Grief is not always putting on a mask of happiness. You can't ignore the grief. If the grief isn't faced, it'll come out in different manners. Things like spending money, overeating, not eating, or maybe jumping into a relationship right away. At some point, grief has to be addressed. Here are some grief indicators, the common signs and symptoms. Shock and disbelief. It's hard to accept death. You may feel numb and maybe question whether the loss really happened, and that's not unusual. Some have noted their initial reluctance to even notify others of the loss in case it turned out to be untrue. And this is normal, as is still imagining that your loved one will call or write or show up, or even if you've mentally accepted their death. Sadness is another grief indicator. We sometimes think that no one will comprehend how deep our grief is, which leads us into even deeper sorrow. And this is why support groups are so important. They offer a safe place where you can be honest with your emotions. Guilt is one that you need to forgive yourself for all the things that you did or didn't say or didn't do. Compassion and forgiveness for yourself and others are essential for the healing process. Anger with the person for not being here anymore, anger towards caregivers for not doing more, or even blaming God. You may not be able to direct your anger against a specific source. You may find that daily small injustices seem much more significant than they may have been in the past. And this is normal. And no one should tell you that you must stop or let go of your anger. That will happen eventually as part of the process on your own timeline. Fear, the loss can trigger fear on many different levels. The thought of a future without that person being in your life can be very frightening. It can cause physical pain even. Grief can manifest in physical symptoms like nausea, fatigue, weight loss or weight gain, loss of sleep, aches and pains. It can even affect your immune system. Taking care of yourself and paying attention to these symptoms is vital in preserving your health during grief. Here are a few myths and facts about grief. The first myth is the pain will go away faster if you ignore it. Fact is, trying to ignore your pain or keep it from surfacing will only make it worse in the long run. A myth, it's important to be strong in the face of loss. The fact is, feeling sad, being frightened, or lonely is a normal reaction to loss, and crying doesn't mean you're weak. Myth. If you don't cry, it means you aren't sorry about the loss. Fact. Crying is not the only response to sadness. There are other ways of showing it. Myth. Grief should last only about a year. But the fact is, there's no right or wrong amount of time to grieve. It's an individual experience that we need to learn and manage day by day. It's important to know that grief triggers exist. It's normal to experience, and if you're aware of them, you may be able to take steps to keep them at a minimum, like planning holidays with family and taking them or talking to them beforehand and expressing expectations. Many things can trigger a return of intense grief, like birthdays, holidays, anniversaries of a death of a loved one. Smells like perfume or cologne, flowers, maybe a favorite food that's cooking. These can be long-term challenges. And there's another thing that happens also that's called second-hand grief, and that's interesting. It's when someone you hardly know dies, but their death triggers your grief again. This is a normal experience. It happens to a lot of people, and you should be allowed to let yourself feel that when it happens. Take care of yourself. Allow yourself time to grieve. Often we push the grief away or push it down by distracting ourselves with activities. Trying to avoid grief only prolongs it. The grief has to be allowed to surface. Unresolved grief can lead to depression, anxiety, substance abuse, and health problems. Express your feelings in a constructive way. This can be done in many ways depending on your creativity or usual means of expression. You can write about your loss in a journal or send a private note to a person that you've lost. You can make a scrapbook, a photo album, or create an online memorial celebrating the person's life. You can also get involved in an organization or philanthropy that was meaningful to the person and maybe make a donation in their name. Be physically healthy. Your mind and your body are connected. Physical health helps emotional healing process. It's natural to feel lethargic or have low energy, but if you're able to take a walk or a run, it'll help promote the process. Combat your fatigue with an appropriate amount of sleep and choose foods that provide not just comfort, but also energy. Don't judge yourself or let others judge you. You're allowed to grieve for as long and as deeply as you need to. No one, including yourself, can tell you when to move on or get over it. It's okay to be angry, to cry, to not cry, or even laugh. You need to allow moments of joy in your grief and feel no guilt for having a moment without pain. Some signs of complicated grief. Now, grief never goes away completely. It's normal, but it should reduce within time. But some people have a lot of difficulty accepting death long after it's occurred. And you may feel stuck or be so preoccupied with the person who's died that it disrupts your daily routine and undermines other relationships. Again, this is why group support is so important. It's an affirmation for your feelings. whether that's anger, guilt, sadness, relief, shame, joy. Here are some signs of complicated grief: intense longing and yearning for the deceased, intrusive thoughts or images about your loved one, denial of the death or a sense of disbelief, imagining that your loved one is still alive, searching for that person in familiar places, avoiding things that remind you of your loved one, extreme anger or bitterness over the death, feeling like life is empty or meaningless. Here are some signs of depression: a general sense of guilt, thoughts of suicide, preoccupation with dying, feeling hopeless or worthless, feeling numb or disconnected for more than a few weeks, or unable to perform normal daily activities. Speaking with your healthcare provider can help you determine what treatment is likely to work best for you. Talking to someone about your feelings is a really good place to start. And this is another reason for support groups. They are essential in the grieving process. These are two resources that I found within my community. Hospice Alliance has grief support at their location. Actually, Hospice Alliance across the nation offers help in communities all over the nation for people who have trouble with grief. And it doesn't have to be where you have a family member or know someone in hospice. It can be for anybody. So you could call Hospice Alliance and talk to them about getting into a grief support group, or even talking personally, one-on-one. And then Holy Spirit Community Church is a sponsor for Grief Share. Pastor Charlie Hansen is one of the liaisons that I worked with. He's a grief and loss coach. He also works with Hospice Alliance and does his Grief Share program through his church. And these are two of the resources, like I said, that I found within the community. And this is to thank Father Bob from St. Anne's Catholic Church for allowing me to present my PowerPoint to everybody. Pastor Charlie Hansen for helping me work through the process of making this presentation, and also Mr. Todd Hall for doing the same, helping me get this project completed.